Wood, metal, concrete and gasoline. A man, a woman, 8 children and deceit. Wood, metal, concrete, gasoline. A man, a woman, 8 children, deceit. Wood and metal, concrete, gasoline. A man, a woman, 8 children, 8 children, deceit and deceit. What is the cost of destruction? Welcome to Extraordinary Stories Podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Welcome to another story, another episode. If you're new and this is your first episode, then hello and welcome. I'm Barry. It's nice to have your ears along for the journey. So shout outs and thank yous. There is really only one. And that is a mass thank you and a mass shout out to everyone who supports and follows the podcast on any form of social media. It is growing intensely. I mean really fast. It's growing really, really fast, which is amazing, which is what I want. So thank you. If you are new to me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, then hello. Don't ever stop getting in touch. Don't ever stop sending me stories. Okay. On with the story in this episode. A tale of buildings, love, deceit, a horrific incident, and possibly madness. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Okay, let's start by imagining you're on your holidays and you are in Wisconsin in the USA. So let's think you're there, okay, you're having a lovely time, you're on holiday, and you're looking for things to do, things that are recommended to do in Wisconsin. Well, one of the places you might be sent to look at is a very famous building called the Taliesin Building. It's a house. A very, very famous house. And it sits on an expanse of land. It sits high up. It's described as it almost looks as if it is floating. It is a big, impressive piece of architecture. But it has a dark, dark history. The property that you would be looking at today in 2018 is in fact the third version of this house. And it's the story about this history of this building, of this house and its dark past, and about the lives destroyed within it that we're going to talk about. So it was built by a man named Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh, Frankie boy. Frankie boy is going to be central to this story. Alright, who was Frank? Well, Frank Wright was born in Wisconsin in 1867, a long time ago. He was born to Father William, who was a music teacher, and to Mother Anna, who was also a teacher. Now, slightly odd fact here, but I kind of loved this when I came across it. When his mother Anna was pregnant with Frank, she started to get some ideas, some thoughts. And now, she wasn't a particularly superstitious woman. You know, she didn't believe in a lot of the sort of jiggery-pokery or... no, I don't mean jiggery-pokery, do I? Hocus pocus. Got there in the end. She didn't believe in a lot of sort of like, oh, you got visions, you got ideas, you got thoughts when you were pregnant, all this came to you. She didn't really believe in it. But she did have one very, very strong, prominent sense, and that was that she felt that the baby that was growing inside her was going to have something to do with buildings. Now, nobody in her family or her husband's family had ever had anything to do with that, but she really felt it. She felt this really strong sense that the entire time she was pregnant, she could see buildings in her head. So when it came to decorating the nursery ahead of the arrival of the baby, Anna decorated the nursery with engravings of cathedrals, and she tore pictures out of books. I mean, most kids get like bears, ponies, Toy Story characters, or just a nice pastel blue, or a nice pastel pink. Oh, not Frank. As a baby, he got cathedrals drawn on his nursery wall. Lovely. But you know, his mother was indeed right. As a child, Frank was obsessed with building things out of anything that he could find. Any household object, he would try and stack things up, build things. Now, I know lots of kids have obsessions with building blocks and they want to, put them together and try and make things. But Frank was like properly obsessed, as in he would spend hours and hours each day just building things out of any material and building blocks that he could find. And as he grew up, his fascination with buildings and with architecture continued to grow, and this was definitely his big passion in life. So I think it's strange that his mother had that sense before he was even born. Odd. Don't really know how to explain that. I just think it's quite interesting. Now he gets to about 14 and his mum and dad divorce, and he would say later that he never saw his father ever again in his life. So Frank goes on to high school and he works hard, and he leaves high school and he goes on to some further study. And actually when he's studying, he studies under a very prominent civil engineer at the time. But he leaves without actually finishing any of his studies because he just wanted to get out into the world and start working. He was kind of impatient that way. You know, that sort of like, he didn't want to just wait for a qualification or wait for anything. He was so like sure of his ideas about architecture and about building. He just wanted to get out into the world. And he was young, he was like 18, 19 years old and determined that he was going to go out there and succeed. I'm getting like Michael J. Fox, Secret of My Success vibes. I'm going to take over the world, that kind of thing. So Frank's out and he's Michael J. Foxing it all over the place. And he sets off from Wisconsin, which, by the way, I'm just going to say at this point, see when you're saying Wisconsin in a Scottish accent, it just sounds completely wrong. I really just want to say Wisconsin, because it just sounds so much better in an American accent. Anyway, I'm going to keep saying it in my Scottish accent. So he leaves and he heads to Chicago. So here's Frank. He's in Chicago and he's just about to turn 20 years old. When he gets to Chicago, it was only a few years after the Great Fire of Chicago, which had destroyed so much of the city. So much of Chicago had been burned down by that huge fire. Fire had ravaged through houses, through public buildings, through shops, and large parts of Chicago lay in ruins. But in that fire, Frank saw an opportunity. A young, plucky guy looking for a chance. He saw this rebuilding of Chicago as a chance for him within the world of architecture. He was just looking for the chance to architect. Don't think that's the right word, but that's what he was looking for. So he finds his way into a firm and he's hired as a draftsman. Now, this is not really what Frank wanted. He didn't want to be doing the draftsman side of the job, which was dealing with legal documents and going out to areas and checking, sizes of land. He wanted to be in the heart of it. He wanted to be the very core of it, designing and building. But, he's still young. Do you know what I mean? He's not even really... Yeah, he's just turned 20. And I get that he's got this passion inside of him. But, Frank, we've all got to start somewhere. You want to, say, work in a magazine, whatever. You can't just walk in there at age 20 and be like, hi there, yes, I'd like to be the editor. Thanks very much. It is not how it works, Frank. You have to start somewhere. But he was bloody ambitious. He was ambitious. So after a few years of being a draftsman, he was totally dissatisfied with this. He'd done enough now with legal documents. And he wanted to get out and design and create. And so he left his position. So he managed to find work as a junior designer for an architect firm who were really impressed with Frank's designs and his ideas. It's said about Frank that he always pushed for progression within the design of buildings. He wasn't into the idea of just throwing up a block of flats or a library. He wanted design to be progressive and modern. He wanted a new, sexy Chicago and not just a functional city. He wanted something that he could really put his stamp on. So the company that he's gone to, called Adler and Sullivan, they were looking for someone who would come along and just, once all the sort of major groundwork had been done, could help to, I guess the best way to put it would be to sort of sex up the designs. To just give everything a bit of flourish, a bit of something artistic. And the company were well impressed with Frank's ideas. They liked what he was doing, what he was coming up with. Now, at this point, Frank is 22 years old. Let's talk about... Now, we know he's a good designer. We know all this, right? We've learned this. Let's talk about what Frank was like as a person. Well, not necessarily the easiest of people to get along with. He had quite a temper. There were reports of actual physical fights in his office over the designs of some houses and some buildings. Frank had no problem in lashing out when someone didn't like one of his designs. Frank also, I think, had ideas slightly above his station about what his status was in life. Believing he was this sort of wonderful young designer, he was living a life where actually he was spending a lot more money than he was actually earning. Trying to sort of move around Chicago City, a bit like a player, a bit like a look at me, I'm big in the game. But he was still very young and didn't really have the money behind him to be acting like that. However, his designs were very popular. And things that he was designing were continuing to be built and to prove to be a success. Now, Frank had been a single man for a good few years, but right now he was about to meet Kitty. Kitty had lived her whole life in Chicago and she belonged to a very wealthy family, and Frank was attracted to this. Kitty was only 17 when they met. He was 22. They quickly fell in love. Now, at the time, Frank was living in his little rented apartment. His bachelor pad, if you will. Well, I say bachelor pad as if I was taking the piss. Actually, it was his bachelor pad because, well, as we'll come to learn, Frank has quite an eye for the ladies. However, he'd now met Kitty, and within a couple of months, they were married. And what he wanted was, he really wanted to build a home for him and for Kitty. And so he went to his boss and he said, look, can I borrow $5,000? I mean, that's a lot of money back then. That's a lot of money. But he said, can I borrow $5,000? Because what I want to do is I want to buy a little plot of land and I want to build my own property for me and my wife. So his boss said, okay, fine. You can borrow £5,000 from the company's money and you can build the house that you want to build. Kitty and Frank moved in to the house that he had designed and built. Almost immediately, they started having their family. Kitty was pregnant with their first child within months of marriage. Frank continued to work for the same firm, designing, building, architecting. Almost 2 months after the birth of their first child, Kitty was pregnant again. No rest for poor Kitty here. Straight on to baby number 2. No hanging about. Now, you remember I said a minute ago that Frank was, well, he wasn't the best with money. He liked expensive things. He was a bit flashy. So he had a really expensive taste in clothing and in cars. Frank liked to look good. He liked to present well. But now, with two young children, he couldn't really afford to be throwing money around on cars or going around buying other drinks in bars. So here's what Frank did. He began working on private projects, designing for people who would pay him discreetly for his work. So none of this was going through Frank's company. He was doing a wee bit of the old freelance work and taking it cash in hand. Now, this supplemented income, it meant that he and Kitty were able to keep having children. Not long after the birth of the second, Kitty was now on to baby number 3. Oh my God, give this woman a break. Give her a chance. Come on. Frank seems to think that Kitty can just fire out babies left, right and centre. Give her a fucking break. Frank's reputation as a ladies' man, it was well known around town. He was flirty, he was charming, and he was attentive to many, many women. Whilst Kitty was at home with the children that she was made to keep producing. Frank would be out in bars, seeing other women, and really, really fully embracing this thing that he had built, this I'm a great architecture. I'm a great architect reputation that he was gaining. He was loving the life that was bringing. So while all this is going on, he's still working on his little secret projects. He's bringing in that secret money. But that's all about to come to an end for Frank. His boss discovers that he's been working secretly. He's been earning money on the side, and he decides he can't have that. He can't have an employee that he cannot trust. And Frank is fired. By now, Frank and Kitty have 4 children. Ooh, all under the age of 6. The relationship between Kitty and Frank was, well, not in a good shape, is the best way you can say. Kitty really, and I get this, she resented the fact that she was home all day, every day, looking after their kids, while Frank would be out and about during the days, working, doing the things that he loved, and then in the evenings he would be relaxing. Something that Kitty got no time to do. I mean, at this point, Frank is living la vida loca. He is living his best life. He's fucking having a laugh, man. He's having an actual laugh. He's got his wife at home with all the kids, and he just keeps forcing her to have more and more and more while he's out doing what he wants. Now, Kitty had heard all the rumours about all the other girls, and she tried to ignore them. She tried to pretend that they just weren't true. So Frank is, now fired from the company he worked for, but his good reputation and all the freelance work that he'd done meant that he was able to use some of the money he'd earned from that to set up and establish his own firm. And this he did in Chicago. He set up a small firm designing houses. So this is 1896, and I'm going to skip forward slightly by a few years. And it's to the time when Frank is successfully designing something called prairie houses. Now, I don't know if maybe some of you live in a prairie house design, but if you do, and if you know what that is, then they were designed by Frank Wright. You will recognise them. I looked at lots of them. Apparently you get lots of these across the Midwest of America. So they've got like a really flat roof, a very, very flat roof, and the roof is almost longer and wider than the building underneath it. And there are windows in the building, but they are very, very, very closely placed together. Look up a prairie house and you'll know instantly what I'm talking about. But that was Frank's design, and it was really popular. And they were popping up all over the place, all over. And there were schools being designed in the same way. And so success just kept coming Frank's way. By now, he and Kitty had 6 children. Oh my God, 6 kids. Frank took very little to do with them. He left it all to Kitty. What a dick. What an actual dick. The money he was making made 6 children affordable, but it didn't mean that he was at all interested in them. He had very little time for his wife. So it's 1903, and he is at the height of his success, and he's designing a house for a client called Edwin Cheney. So Frank goes along to meet with Edwin to discuss the job, and when he gets there, Edwin's wife is also at the meeting. and she is a beautiful woman called Mima. Frank starts to fancy Mima instantly. He takes a real liking to her. But she's married. However, so's Frank. Mima has 2 children. However, Frank also has children. Mima also took a liking to Frank, and the two of them, they begin an affair. Mima gets described as a very modern woman, an early feminist. And Frank liked that because he felt like she was intelligent and they could talk about things. Now, I don't know who the fuck Frank thinks he is. I really don't. He did nothing to keep his affair with Mima secret. They would just go out in public together, even though the two of them were both married and both had families. They would go to bars, they would walk around the town arm in arm, and they became town gossip. Everyone knew about this affair, as did the press. Frank Wright was big news in the building press, and having an affair with a married woman while he was a married man, it was scandalous. Now, Kitty, she found out about the affair, but she said to herself, oh, this is just something that will pass. So Frank has a small fascination with another woman. It'll no doubt pass. Oh, Kitty, Kitty, Kitty. Oh, it didn't pass. It did not pass at all. This is what Frank and Mima did next. They both left their respective spouses and children, and they ran away to Europe together. So Frank left behind 6 children, and Mima left behind 2. The bare-arsed cheek of it to just run off together and leave your spouses and your kids behind. But that's what they did. So, the couple have completely abandoned their lives in America and they live in Europe for a year. And after a year, Frank decides he'd like to move back to the USA because he feels like he can build more over there. He feels like he would like to go back to Chicago or Wisconsin because there he can build things. And this is what he decides to do. He decides that he's going to build a property, and that property is going to be a place for Mima to live so that she could go back to the USA, and that the two of them could live in the property that he was going to build. The plan was he would build this property in Wisconsin. Mima would return, live there. She would get back her children. I mean, does she deserve them back? I don't know. You fucked off and left them for a year. But that was the plan. And so Frank began work. And before long, he had built a staggering property. The Taliesin was built. This is the house that I was saying to you earlier on. If you were a tourist in Wisconsin, you'd be going to visit this. That was where Mima and himself and her 2 kids were going to spend the rest of their lives. Or that's what Frank thought. Because there is a reason for it being a tourist attraction, and that's its dark history. Let's talk about why. And so, to do that, what we need to do is turn our attention to a new character in the story. A man called Julian Carleton. Okay. Who was Julian? Well, Julian was a man who'd been born in Barbados, but he'd come to the USA in search of work. Now, when he arrived, he was willing to do any sort of job that he could to earn money. He would take any job that was going. And the kind of work that he found himself falling into was working in really big, posh houses. Sometimes as a cook, sometimes a handyman, just general staff. Now, Julian had a wife. Her name was Gertrude. She too was from Barbados. They had come to the USA together. Now, when work on the Taliesin was finished, Frank and Mima, they were looking for staff. And so they interviewed Julian and his wife Gertrude, and both were employed. Gertrude and Julian would do most of the cooking for the household. And Julian was responsible for serving nearly all of the meals in the house. Julian and Gertrude, they were in their mid-20s. They had no children, so jobs like this suited them. It meant that what they had was a steady income. They had somewhere to live. That was great for them. So the Taliesin that Frank had built, it was yet another press scandal. The house built for his mistress was quite shocking at the time. People just couldn't believe that he'd run away, left Kitty with her 6 kids, and built this really impressive property only to house his mistress and her 2 children. So when Mima returned, she had in fact got her 2 children back. And her kids were son John, he was 12, and daughter Martha, she was 9. And they now lived with their mother and Frank in the Taliesin property. Quite often Frank had to go away for bits and pieces of work to other states or other parts to work in. So, let's go to 1914, and it's a typical day in the Taliesin house. Mima had spent the morning with her 2 children, playing and reading, and after lunch, served by Julian Carlton, they spent the afternoon in the grounds of the property, picking flowers and playing in the garden. Now Frank, he was away in Chicago working. Julian Carlton was working alone that day in the kitchen. His wife Gertrude had the day off. And although the major work on the Taliesin property was completed, there was still the odd little odd jobs around the house that needed to be done. There was still some woodwork to be finished, some carpets to be properly put down. And so it meant that on this day, there were a few different handymen around the property. Carpenters, that sort of thing. One of the handymen he had brought along with him his 13-year-old son. So, dinner time arrives on this particular day. Now there are a total of 9 people in the house, and those 9 people are all going to eat dinner. Mima and her 2 children, John and Martha, they sit down at their usual dining table in the dining room, and they are ready for dinner. And now the 6 other people, the workman and the 13-year-old son, they sat at another table in a different room. Not far away really from where Mima sat with her 2 kids, but just in a different room. So Julian Carlton begins to serve dinner. The first course he serves is soup. And they eat this. Fine. He comes, he clears everything away, takes it back to the kitchen, and he tells them that the second course won't be long. Julian then brings out the second course, the meat course. He serves it up to the 9 hungry people. Now, as the 9 people are eating their dinner, Julian goes to the workmen at their table and he says, "Does anyone have any gasoline? I've spilled something on a carpet and I'd like to use it to remove the stain." I was not aware that you could use gasoline to remove a stain, but apparently you can. So one of the workmen says, yeah, okay. I've got some, you can go and this is where you can find it. So they're just carry on, they're eating the second course of their dinner. As they're eating it, Julian Carlton goes around the Taliesin property and begins to lock every single door except for one. Once he has locked almost every door, he takes the gasoline that he's got from the workmen and he begins to pour it on the carpets. He begins to pour it on anything flammable in the house. Completely unaware, the 9 people continue to eat. Julian Carlton goes at this point into the kitchen and he retrieves an axe. As Mema and her 2 children sit and eat, Julian Carlton walks up behind Mema, raises the axe above her and strikes her through the head with the axe. And in one single blow, he splits her head in 2, killing her immediately at the dinner table. He then turns to her 12-year-old son, John, and does the exact same thing. John dies on the table there and then. Martha, the 9-year-old, she gets up from the table and she tries to run. But as she runs, Julian catches her, and with 2 blows of the axe, she's dead. And at this point, Julian, he strikes a match. He throws it down to the carpets and he leaves through the one door that he didn't lock. Inside the house, an inferno begins. 3 dead bodies are lying in the dining room and the 6 others are trapped inside the burning house. The fire spreads rapidly. Through the property. And the men, they start running and looking around for any kind of exit. When one of them gets to the door that he thinks he can maybe get through to get away from the fire, Julian is waiting on the other side, on the outside of the house, with an axe. The man decides he's going to take his chance and try to fight Julian. He gets outside and Julian kills him immediately with an axe blow to the head. A second workman, he tries the same thing. He tries to get out of the burning building through the door, and again, Julian attacks him. However, this attack only makes this man fall to the ground. He's not actually dead. He is severely injured and he's suffering some very bad burns, but he's not dead. Julian thinks that he's killed him, but this man is not dead. Within minutes, the entire Taliesin is burning like a bonfire. One of the workmen, who has received some very bad burns, is looking out of the windows frantically, and he can see Julian Carlton running around outside of the property with the axe, looking to see if anyone else was trying to get out of the burning building. He sees his chance, he runs through the door, and he manages to run from the property, and he gets onto the grounds, and he runs to raise the alarm. He runs to the nearest house that he can find, and it's the house of the local priest. He explains to him the Taliesin is on fire, and there are bodies inside and a servant with an axe. So immediately the priest jumps into action. He pulls together a posse of people who will accompany him to the property and attempt to extinguish the fire and to find Julian Carlton. So they get there, they see the absolute blaze. They split up, they try to search the grounds to try and find Julian, but nothing. He can't be found. Firefighters, they do their best to extinguish the fire. They really try their hardest, but within 3 hours, Frank's masterpiece, Taliesin, is burned to the ground. And in total, there are 7 dead bodies. Police continue to search the surrounding areas for Julian Carlton, but with no luck. A few hours after the fire had extinguished, the police still cannot find Julian. They just assume that what he's done is he has fled the scene. He's run off. But one of the officers, well, he has a different feeling. He says, maybe he hasn't. Maybe he stayed a little closer to the scene of the crime. And this officer was right. When they conducted a search of the land around the house, they found Julian Carlton hidden inside a large outdoor furnace which was on the property. That's where they discovered him. But what they discovered when they found Julian is that he had consumed an entire bottle of acid in an attempt to kill himself. However, the acid, it hadn't killed him. It had done him, of course, fucking hell, some serious damage, but he was still alive. He was arrested, he was charged, and while he awaited trial, he received medical treatment for the injuries that the drinking acid had done to his body. So why? Why did this happen? Why did Julian Carlton, the servant in that house, lock all the doors, kill Mima and her 2 kids with an axe, and then attempt to take the lives of everyone else in the property? Well, he refused to answer. Julian Carlton would give no motivation for his actions. He refused to tell anyone what he was thinking that night. He was asked why were Mima and her 2 children killed by an axe and the first to die. Just tell us that. No, he wouldn't. He wouldn't say a word. So word got to Frank pretty quickly that this devastating event had happened at the Taliesin. So he has to travel back from Chicago to the remains of the house that he once built. And now this is so exceptionally awkward. This is just, this is awful. On his return journey, he had to share a part of that journey with Maima's husband. The man who Maima had left behind. The man who she had abandoned with 2 kids while she ran off to Europe with her lover. This man, he was coming back to reclaim the bodies of his children from that property, and him and Frank, they had to share a part of that journey. Oh, I don't even want to think what the tension between those two must have been like. I don't even want to think what the fucking conversations must have been like. So after 7 weeks in prison, Julian Carlton began to show real complications. Due to starvation, he had refused to eat as soon as he entered prison, and complications, of course, from the absolute irreversible damage that he'd done to his intestine by drinking acid. The night before he died, people pleaded with him for a reason. Did he give any reason for this act? No. And so the crime remains a mystery. Why 7 people died in the most brutal of ways is not known. Now, of course, you can't have a mysterious crime without there being theories. That is the law. That's the actual law. Well, it's certainly the law of, I think, the podcast true crime world. You cannot have a crime without theories. And so there are a few. The first points the finger at Kitty, Frank's ex-wife with 6 children. This theory says that Kitty was so mortified that Frank had left her, had built a home for his new mistress, that Kitty was behind it, that she had asked Carlton to kill Maima and her kids. Possible, but not really. No one could really prove that. I don't think Kitty did not come across to people as the kind of woman who was so hell-bent on revenge that she would have done this. Theory 2, was Frank behind this himself? Now, I know that sounds outlandish, but it's rumoured that at the time, while in Chicago, Frank had met himself another lady. And that actually maybe Frank had decided he no longer wanted Maima. He no longer wanted Maima and her 2 kids hanging about, so maybe the best idea was to get rid of her. Because, looking at it, Frank had enough money to build as many new properties as he wanted, so losing a property, maybe not that big a devastation to Frank. Police decided to not really pursue that. And they decided that because Frank was genuinely devastated at the death of Maima. And there was just no proof. That house, in many ways, it kind of was his masterpiece. So the idea that he'd actually decided to kill his mistress within his masterpiece, it didn't hold up for police. Theory 3, perhaps Julian Carlton was just having a mental breakdown. Perhaps on that day he just decided he had had enough of fucking life and decided he was going to create a massive crime. But when examined during his 7 weeks in prison, psychiatrists could not find anything that backed up that theory. They examined him in detail in prison and they said he's perfectly sane. Why he committed this act, he won't say, we'll never know, but this man was not unstable. Also, I've got slight problems with that idea that he just had a mental breakdown on that day and did that, because actually there's quite a lot of meticulous planning in actually how he carried that out Do you know what I mean? Like, you kind of could hear it and go, oh, well, he just went for them with an axe and then set fire to the house. He actually didn't. Do you know what I mean? There was a bit of thought went into that. You know, the way that he made sure that they'd had their first course, they were quite settled, nobody was moving anywhere, no one was going anywhere. He went, he asked about the gasoline. Do you know, I just think there was something that is very premeditated about it. So the fourth and the final, and this one is ridiculous. It holds no real water, but this is what people in the nearby towns believed. They believed that this was actually Frank's punishment for having left his wife and having left his kids behind and for building a love nest with his mistress. They thought this was God striking Frank in the heart for his terrible behaviour. I think that's the least likely of them all. So the bodies of Mema and her children, they were buried on the grounds of the Taliesin at Frank's insistence. Now, Frank set about quickly rebuilding it, as if the fire had never happened. Within 1 year, it was completely rebuilt. Frank, by this point, he wasn't hanging about. He had himself a new mistress, and he moved her straight in to the newly built house. Slightly creepy when you think that he moved his new mistress in to the house, and on the grounds of the house were buried the bones of his mistress, who'd only died a year before. Yeah, I don't know that I'd be... I don't know if I'd be loving that. Remember that I said in the beginning and in the middle that if you were a tourist, you would want to go and you'd want to see the Taliesin. But do you remember I also said in the beginning that this was the third time this house had been built? Well, 25 years after the second time that Frank built it, guess what happened? Another fire. A devastating fire that burnt it to the ground. This time, no one died in the fire. No one was home when it happened. But the building was burnt to the ground. And the cause of the fire was reported as faulty wiring. Right, this meant that for the third time in his lifetime, Frank Wright set about rebuilding the Taliesin. I mean, I know it's your masterpiece, man, but geez, 3 times. 3 fucking times. So, Frank Wright died age 91. And there are museums in his honour. There are books. There are websites. And he is one of the most celebrated architects of the 20th century. But still, no one to this day can explain why his servant Julian Carlton decided to destroy Frank's greatest work and his family in a brutal and unforgettable crime. And so ends the story. Okay. Awful crime. Awful, awful, fucking awful. Oh, imagine. Do you know what I was thinking? That would not be a good crime scene to go and visit. At the time, I mean, that must have been horrific. God, if you were part of the police who had to go at that point and have to see that, must have just been terrible. I just really feel for her. Mema, yeah, okay, she had an affair with a man who was married and whatever, and she didn't deserve to get an axe through her head. But I just really feel for her kids. It's like they were 12 and 9 years old. They didn't know what the fuck was going on. Do you know what I mean? Their mum had fucked off and left them for a year, came back, moved them into a new house, and before too long they're being axed through the head. Oh, awful. Anyway, get in touch. Let me know your thoughts. If you want to get me, you can. Like I said in the beginning, the social media, it's growing. So please be a part of that. Keep getting in touch. Join the Facebook group. It's incredible. The Facebook group's now a year old, and I put up a little celebration video yesterday about being a year old. It was kind of funny for me because I was going through like old posts from months ago. There's just so much stuff goes on in it that it's just hilarious, and just, yeah, it was just really funny for me to do that. So if you want to get me, join the Facebook group, like the Facebook page. I know not everyone's a Facebook person, so I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. You can email me all the time, extraordinarystoriespodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to phone me, my phone number is 0793442. I'm kidding on. Yeah, okay. So, until the next time, okay? Goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over.